And so we want to welcome Met Levi Uku to Africa Speaks.
Thank you.
You know, for those who don't know what Met means, what is Met?
Attorney?
Yes, attorney in French. Your French is good. Anyway, so good to have you on the show, I'm sure. Everybody's happy to have you here and talk about some things that, how the diaspora can be of impact to the continent. But first things first, let's find out how you came about being in this country to begin with, where you're from, and what was the journey?
Well, for those of you that don't know, I'm Nigerian by birth. I did my first education up to the first degree level in Nigeria, where I studied Northern European philosophy, thought and literature. And then I came here about 30 years ago, and I went into law, the study of law and practice of law.
Very curious, why the practice of law? You studied philosophy?
Philosophy, literature.
And then?
Well,
did you always want to become an attorney?
No, not initially. Initially, you know, I've always have interest in literature and history. That is my first love, actually.
Really?
Yeah, literature and history. And when I came to the US, I decided to go into law because it just made more meaning.
Mm-hmm. First, why did you come to the United States?
Because I have family here. I have family that lived here for like 50 years.
Okay. Yeah. I've always found it fascinating for Nigerians that come to the United States for further education, because Nigeria has some of the best universities compared to a lot of other countries in Africa. True?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure about that.
Really?
But they do have universities. The universities used to be excellent.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure about the quality at the present.
Really?
At the present.
Okay.
But it used to be, we had University of Ibadan, Soka,
Ilorin, name them.
International universities. But I don't know about the quality now.
Yeah, because I know students used to leave other countries and go to Nigerian universities on scholarship.
Right.
Actually. So that's really, so we know we need to get our acts together, African countries. We really do. And that's why we have to have this conversation. So what areas of law do you practice?
Well, I do civil, I do bankruptcies, real estate, because they go hand in hand. And I help with people losing their houses, or if there's any real estate fraud, I handle that up to trials, and I get settlements for my clients.
I've heard from the grapevine that if a client shows up, Major Levi will deliver,
Well, it takes two to tango, like they say. If the client is cooperative,
correct,
and willing to listen to advice, then we could help him.
Well, mind you that you're an attorney where stalwarts like the late John Cochrane, we have Robert Shapiro, we have Thomas Girardi, Gloria Allred, practice law in this state, in this city. How challenging is it? Do you measure yourself, or do you look at them as, people you aspire to become?
Well, not necessarily, because let's take some of these people without mentioning their names. They practice law, they're mostly publicity-oriented attorneys, so it's not really the way we practice law.
Okay.
Yeah, so, so I don't really see them as role models in that aspect.
Correct. Well, you know what? We're in Los Angeles, Beverly Hills, Hollywood. Everything is about the drama and the publicity and everything. So how does an African attorney like you become so successful?
Well, I try to do law practice in the traditional format. I get to know families.
Okay.
And I work with families. So even though I don't advertise, I've worked with a lot of families over the years. So I have repeat business and loyalty. So I realized that those sources coming from self-referral, like families, they're more sustainable than trying to go and convince somebody to retain you. And so that works for me.
The reason I say that the way you do it, it's so amazing, because a lot of young people have passed the board or the bar, and are unable to have their own practice. So it's really important that they listen. Your clients are not just African, right? What's the makeup of your clientele?
Well, my client is maybe 1% African. My clients are mostly Americans, of a very divergent client. I have Americans, I have Iranians, I have Mexicans, Chinese, and South Americans. So in a year, I may have one African client.
Isn't that what you call you've crossed over?
Well,
Crossed over, because you know how we always start with friends, family, you know, and then before you're fortunate, before you break through. So when we talk about like racial disparities, racism, and all these things, I guess when you do a good job, doesn't really matter.
Yes, also it's personality too.
Okay.
Being able to interact with various people of various background, and when I have my interaction with folks, I don't see them as white. And sometimes I tell my family when I go back to Nigeria that, you know, sometimes I forget that I'm black. You know, because I just do my thing.
Do the job.
Yes, and so I don't really try to see them as white or Hispanic. They're just people to me.
So do you think that those who don't make it, maybe those are some of the impediments, that they're too focused on their culture?
That could be, because if you set some mental boundaries to yourself, then, of course, the result will be boundaries. So it's better to think outside of the box if you're going to succeed in a complex society like Southern California.
You know, for someone that says literature was their passion, you seem a little too passionate about the law.
Well, I have been doing it for a long time, so, you know, I would say I was like a reluctant bride.
A reluctant bride who now loves the husband.
Yeah, then I love it, you know, so.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So do you still explore your literature and history? How do you explore that passion?
Well, I do keep it up because I read every day. I'm just totally, completely into it. I love it.
Yes.
So I read. I remember a long time ago, I'm reading about the difference between Shia Islam and Islam. And so I started reading. My wife was like, what, the FBI may come and arrest you? Where are you reading this stuff? Every night. I said, well, I'm trying to understand because I saw similarities between Shia practice and Catholicism.
Ah.
It's exactly the same. The way they organize themselves, they have, like, for example, they have saints in
They do?
Catholicism.
Yes, in Catholicism.
They also have saints.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. I think that is the divergence between them and the Sunni Muslims. That's where they have problems.
We need to have a whole show with you about that.
Anyway, so that is my passion.
Yeah, so that's how you explore your passion.
Yeah,
That's
yes,
good.
yeah.
I guess they say passion is something that you do even when you're not getting paid for it.
Yeah, I agree with you on that.
Yes. Now let's talk about your interest in Africa, because we said in our introduction that you have a keen interest in everything Africa, and especially in, you know, participating in constitutional and all these kind of changes in the system. Why do you have such a passion for the continent? I mean, I love Africa. I'm from Africa, but I'm not trying to go there and change everybody.
Well, my love for Africa is just natural.
Right.
Because we're in the US and we enjoy this country.
Yeah.
I love it. But we have to agree that, like, the house I built was built before even my father was born.
That's
Somebody built that house. So I believe that we as Africans must always keep in touch with who we are and our roots and contribute into Africa. Even though we live here, it should not cut you off from doing your bit for Africa, so that generations coming could see your footprint. That is my basic philosophy of Africa.
Do you think most of the problems that African countries face have to do with the systems in place? Because I know you, from the background of the law, that's where you really seem to want to focus on. What is the impediment, especially as far as the systems in Africa, that hinder the continent to be as progressive as it could be?
Well, I believe it's a leadership and, to an extent, a followership issue. One, leadership, because I believe the leaders in Africa don't quite understand the basic concept of governance. and they don't understand the basic rules of making public policy. And therefore, if you have a conversation with African politicians and you try to point out maybe some things that they could do better, they tell you this is not America. And so they shut down. And let's take, for instance, agricultural policy. How do we lend to a tomato farmer? Gives a loan of 5,000 so that person produces tomato for the country. That we have not been able to do in Africa. But in the West, they figure how to give long-term loans to, say, tomato farmers or fishermen. These are goods that are perishable, but yet they will give them a loan of 20 years. So those intricacies are things that need to be studied. So the economists, who are the advisors of government, have to realize that the economic policy has to be grounded in law. So therefore, it's binding on successive government, and also it creates a definite path.
I'm so happy that you mentioned this idea of this is not America. I get so tired of it. Like, you know, the policy, the theory that you shouldn't reinvent the wheel. Like, America has set a template.
Right.
I guess that's what you're suggesting.
Exactly.
Just follow the template.
Exactly.
What do you think is the reason for the hesitancy to just copy something that's already working?
I think it's intellectual laziness. Because if you look at the Chinese, for example, they are not really fond of research. Chinese are not like Indians, who are probably more into research, or the US. They duplicate. They take the American template and they immerse it with cheap labor. And that's the miracle that they have. Because if you look at Deng Xiaoping, who was the leader that made this change, when the argument came whether to follow communism or capitalism, he said that if you have a rat problem in your house and you have a cat that will do the job, doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white. A cat is a cat. It will catch the mouse. Therefore, if capitalism will bring food to the table and dignity to Chinese, let's do it. And they've done the American way to the point that the Americans now are going there for production. Exactly. That's how efficient they are.
Yes.
And they didn't think like, well, this is not America. So we need to bridge that gap, that unbridled nationalism that we have by our leaders.
Is that what you call capitalist communism then?
Well, I think it's a mixture of both, with the Chinese experimentation of capitalism. Here they are capitalists in all intent and purpose. But when it comes to control, they don't want to lose their political control, so they have communism.
And so you know what? There's no exclusive method of governing. I guess.
But it's working.
It's working, and that's what that matters.
It's more, in the U.S., even though we love liberty and freedom, but it's like excessive debate.
That's true.
With not much being done these days.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, let's go back to our continent, our beloved continent. I mean, here you are, intelligent, with vision, ideas, and I can tell you that I have met so many bright Africans. So why are we having a leadership crisis when we all think this way? What is going on?
Well, because the folks running the affairs in Africa, governance, like I said earlier, they are not really, they're a bit shallow.
Yeah, but how can we get rid of them?
Well, I'm not going to advocate.
We're not advocating
a revolution. However, I'm just hoping that there has to be some sort of opening in their mind to realize that people in the diaspora, these are like exports that they've exported these human beings to the West. And they've absorbed a lot of knowledge. And they need to take that knowledge back to their countries and let it drip into the system. And there'll be benefits, I believe so.
That brings me to the diaspora. Before we get to the diaspora, accountability has to be a factor in all of this. Because I think if you are accountable to me, then I can dictate whether you should be there or not. Is that something you want to touch a little bit on?
Yeah, but one of the reasons I believe that the African leadership has excluded African expatriates abroad is because of accountability. Because they want to do what they're doing without challenge. So without thinking that they have to be accountable to anybody. And unfortunately, that has not boded well for our people.
You're right. Because I always wondered, we all come here, and as a matter of fact, most of those leaders come to the United States, they go abroad to Europe and see amazing structures, inventions, innovations, and yet the continent is struggling. And we're not, I mean, there are some countries and leaders that we all know are doing an amazing job. So for those who are doing an amazing job, kudos to them. But for those countries, and it's the majority that are struggling, you know, it's either a dictatorship where there is growth, or it's a dictatorship with no growth. I mean, we can break it down. All across Africa, most of the countries, dictatorship and growth, or dictatorship and no growth.
Well, going back to what you just said, I believe if, you know, even when the leaders visit the US or other Western countries, those are just mere visits. That doesn't give them the gravitas or the background to understand the mechanism. It's like driving a car. You buy a car from the lot. It's great. You start engine and you drive. Does that make you a mechanic? No. So these leaders, they come to the US, maybe stay in the best hotels, get service. They can't just go and get a blueprint and start going to, you know, repeating the same thing in their countries. That's not what they're going to do, because those visits does not prepare them for governance. I believe that in order to learn how to govern, those of us that have had the privilege and opportunity to be in these systems and observe the mechanism of how government works, which, if you truly understand, it's sort of like it's almost automated. But back there, government is so personalized. Like, for example, let's say Nigeria, where I come from, pensions for retired workers. And the governor sits on it for like 2 years, thinking whether should I approve this pension or not. Here it's automated. Those are what they call, those are actually not negotiated in the budget. Those are mandated expenditure that the governor could be sleeping. The computers is repeating the governor's signature on the checks. It doesn't have to make a personal decision of whether or not pensions have to be paid. But back there, the entire budget is negotiable.
That beats my imagination. I've always asked myself that question still, because these are funds that have already been deducted from the pensioner, or the person that's supposed to receive their pension. And yet it needs an approval from the government.
That's where
I don't. So what the heck are they learning when they come to United Nations? What they come there for, though?
Well, the United Nations, I don't think it's a place for learning. They are coming there, they, like I said, unbridled nationalism. They go there and put on their traditional dress as if it is a fashion show. I don't think they're there to learn. And because if somebody got a job in 1990, and you know he's going to retire in 30 years, why are you making retirement plans 2 years after he has retired and disengaged, when you had 30 years to put in place the retirement? So those basic governance issues, those are not political issues. They're just basic craftsmanship of governance. That we play politics with everything. Even corruption is political. Everything is political, but it's lack of basic understanding of governance. I think the leadership in Africa has been stolen from the people who ought to be leaders. We have rulers in Africa, not leaders.
Ooh, we do have rulers. But you know, someone will give you the argument that the reason they're unable to govern is because of Western imperial effects on the leaders or the rulers.
But that's cliche. that has been an excuse for non-performance. The Western, let's say, let's say my country, Nigeria, the Westerners have disengaged.
Long time ago.
A long time ago, and there's a God-given thing called oil that are giving Nigeria almost $1 trillion in less than 60 years. Yet, there is nothing to show for it. The governance at the top, there's no institutional approach to governance. Everything is discretionary. If somebody does wrong, let's say, somebody steals $1 billion, and the police is waiting for the president for directive to arrest the person. But you took an oath as a police officer to fight crime wherever crime comes from. Why are you waiting for the president? And so the governance is not, the system is not fully defined. They inherited a colonial system that was not there for governance. It was there for oppression. And these Africans have inherited that system from the colonial masters and just step into the shoes of these colonial masters. So if you suggest that they need reform, they tell you we already have laws. Why do you need to make reforms? Those laws were created by colonial masters. So they are the kings and monarchs of Africa. And if you permit me, let's say, for example, immunity. How can you have absolute immunity in present-day Nigeria or Africa? A president could go and murder somebody and you can't arrest him. A governor could kill and you say there's absolute immunity. Absolute immunity was during the Victorian era. It has grown over the years to what is called qualified immunity. So that is why there's investigations against, say, President Trump, because his immunity is not absolute.
There you go.
But in Africa, they are now, they tie on the toga of Queen Elizabeth era immunity in today's modern world. So those are the governance issues that if you need accountability of our leaders, immunity, the AU should work on modernizing the notion of immunity in Africa so that the leadership is brought from this pedestal to a point of accountability.
But you know they do say that the people deserve their leader, right?
Yeah,
so why they're not reacting?
Because they don't know. They think that they don't know. That that's why I said it's a problem of leadership and followership. When we started this, yeah. So that is where the followership, because we clap for these people as citizens. We love them. Yeah. We worship them. But instead of them being accountable to us, we are accountable to them. They steal our mandate. They abuse their powers, and the public, the citizens, do not know that sovereignty rests with the citizens. When all the citizens come together, that is the sovereignty. It's not the land, it's the people. So that transition is not there yet. People do not know that the totality of the people are the sovereign.
Absolutely.
And not one person who claims to be the president.
And yet they're all democratic countries. They're all democratic countries. And that brings us now to diaspora. I hope that after this conversation, you'll be able to go to Nigeria because, in essence, the government has kidnapped, or the leaders have kidnapped the countries, hijacked the countries from the people.
Well, one thing with that is good with Nigeria, they're not really interesting people willy-nilly because of opinion.
All
so
right.
that one.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure that African Speaks will not have to come.
I know.
So let's talk about now, in the face of all these issues that we've basically explored, how can the diaspora, in your opinion, be a source of respite for the challenges that Africa faces? And let's start with some areas. For example, if we let's talk about the financial empowerment aspect. You think about let me give you a direction. Think about the fact that statistics shows that contributions from the diaspora in remittances is over $40 billion a year. And, some people have argued that it's counterproductive without proper structures, institutional structures, to make sure that this money is being, is helping the countries grow. what, in your opinion, how can we do from the diaspora to make sure that this money really brings some solutions to some of Africa's economic problems?
It is, I agree, it's a management issue. Let's say, for example, last year, the remittances into Nigeria was 22 billion. But I'm afraid to tell you that I've yet to read anywhere how that 22 billion was captured into the GDP. Somehow between the banks and not, that money, I'm afraid, has not made it to the treasury. But if you compare countries like in India or Philippines, if you look at their foreign reserves, it's about 89 billion. India is about 346 billion. The component of that, the structure of those reserves, say for the Philippines, it's like almost 30–40% from remittances. Because they've figured out how they're able to capture these remittances into their treasury. So it stabilizes their trade balance, it stabilizes their foreign exchange, so that the totality of the people benefit. But in Africa, the prominence of the remittances somehow is opaque. And I believe that need to be resolved. Because let's say a country like, say, Zimbabwe, and I think their remittances is about $1 billion. Okay, if they're sending $1 billion to Zimbabwe, what has happened to the funds? How come it's not focused? And they could make some arrangements or policy whereby the government exchange their local currency to the families as beneficiaries in exchange for the foreign currency to go into their reserve. At least that is more sustainable than, say, crops. Because the crops, the prices goes up and down, oil is volatile. But remittances is actually more sustainable. Because in the past 20 years, let's say Nigeria, for example, they've received an average of at least 22 billion, some years 39 billion, up to, yeah. So, but it's unaccounted for, I believe. So those things, those are simple, easy plucking for any economic policy maker to say, okay, China is exporting goods to Africa. We're exporting human beings. It's an item of trade.
That's true.
All over the world. And the remittances, we don't have to wait for the West to tell us that the remittances from Africans coming in should and should not be part of the GDP. Let's take our own destiny in our own hands and decide what constitutes our GDP.
So now that you've laid it all out, it sounds all easy. Other countries are doing it. So how can we capture our remittances in a way that's beneficial?
I think they should, for example, Western Union, Zoom, those are mechanisms whereby people are sending monies to Africa.
Okay.
And the government should decide that money should go into the treasury. So therefore, the agents back home, let's say if they're using banks, they should act as a contractor for the central bank. So the central bank should have dedicated funds for the exchange. So when the family goes for their remittances, the money given to the family should be central bank funds in exchange for the dollars that goes into the reserve. Right now, the money, the transaction ends with the banks. So it does not make it, so the dollars or the foreign exchange do not make its way into the reserve. And I believe those dollars now becomes a way for politicians to use their stolen wealth to now give to the families through the banks in exchange for this foreign exchange that they now promptly take it and repatriate overseas. So that is the, so we need to make sure that we create a simple mechanism. When the money comes, the bank role should be for a fee to act as a middleman. The dollars by law, there has to be law. They said that money belongs to the reserves.
So essentially, the systems of the government will be working in partnerships with the remittance companies here.
Exactly, yes.
Makes sense. Well, I hope that someone is listening. Yeah.
That's what I
We'll
believe.
channel this maybe through the ministries of finance and in
Well,
the
if they
different.
will listen, if they will listen.
If they will listen, Mr. Levi will be here to give direction. Let's talk about some other things that diaspora can really, hopefully, be of help, because we've talked about different things, mostly about governance and accountability and all of this. We think about it. What about the narrative about the continent, poverty, disease? I really want to get your take on it and how we in the diaspora can change these myths about the continent.
Well, the diasporans, I've participated and I've seen people going there on volunteer missions for various aspects.
Yeah.
It could be family planning, eye clinics, and whatever. That is good, but we need a critical mass. That is like a bandage. It's not a solution. So I still believe that the diaspora have to be involved, or at least express interest in making some, maybe create pressure groups from abroad. And hopefully the politicians back home will not have a pushback. So it's a policy. If we have some good policy, when I went home last year, I ran into this lady that has been a nurse and a midwife in Scotland for over 30 years and decided to relocate. And so she opened a pharmacy, and her brother too is a doctor. They opened a clinic and a pharmacy, but there was no patronage. So after 4 years, they decided to go back to Scotland because there was no patronage. And even though the passion was there, that let me come home and share my expertise. If there was a government policy whereby there's some sort of public insurance for health, even for just to cover the basic needs, and people will go, or the patients will go to the pharmacy with no money, but if they could bill just basic, first the malaria, whatever, they would have, then that venture would have been sustainable.
Right.
Because if you can open a hospital and the people here treating have no insurance, have no money, and some of them are owed salaries for 6 months, it's not going to go anywhere. And we need the private sector driven participation of the diasporans to move that envelope.
You know, a lot of diasporans complain about going home, just like you said, and not having that support from the government. Is there a way that they can still have impact, whether or not you have government support? Because we've already established that we have rulers who really don't care, but most of us have relatives, we have friends. Not everybody can come to the United States. And then we also have people that grumble that, oh, diasporans don't want to return home. How can we establish partnership with or without the government to create opportunities back home?
I think it's a funding issue, and let's go to AIDS. When the AIDS problem was ravaging Africa, and I think President Bush Jr. created a fund of about either $200 million or $400 million, whereby the medication for HIV, the generic was made available to every person that sick or sought help in that aspect in Africa. It brought down the price. Up to today, people benefit from that. So it's free. The medication is free. So it's a mechanism that we need to probably, maybe the World Bank or wherever, or African Development Bank, they will create a mechanism and maybe define the qualifications and a method. Maybe the governments could pay into it through the African Development Bank, and and that issue could be addressed, because then there'll be technology transfer from the diasporans, and that policy will be more sustainable, because these are homegrown people returning. So they're not going to come for 6 months and just at the first sign of any problem run back to the West. So, and I believe that there just have to be a mechanism established. And if that happens, then the issues you've raised about disease, poverty, could begin to be addressed.
Absolutely. Well, you do know the African Union has named the diaspora, is it the sixth region? The sixth region of the African Union. I imagine that every African country should have a department or ministry of the diaspora affairs. What have you any thoughts about the impact of this sixth region of the African Union being a bridge?
Well, I noticed that in Nigeria they've created a diaspora commission. But as in all teams Africans, there are no details. In my opinion, if you're going to have a diaspora commission, it should be a technical, hands-on mechanism to either increase remittances. You know, it has to be a focused, committed organization. But in this case, they bring politicians, they appoint local politicians. That has nothing in common with diasporans. So they just become a mouthpiece of government. So it's an opportunity lost. The AU declared the diaspora as the sixth region. You see, what is missing in all 10 Africans, there's no details. It's just a pluralistic, futuristic, feel good, you know. But if they, like I said earlier, there's no craftsmanship into that. They could carefully draft that thing into law. And it's like creating a human being. The details has to be there. Then it becomes meaningful.
Correct. But
just making a declaration, and then you can't act on it. You know, it's like in America they call it unfunded mandate. It's just a declaration. Okay, it's just a declaration.
It's a declaration.
So it does not transmit into reality.
We have long ways to go, Mr. Uku. Levi, so let me ask you about something that probably your area, that maybe give us some input, because some of us come from countries where dual citizenship is not an option, which means the moment you become an American citizen, you're no longer considered a citizen of your country. Do you remain a national of that country, though? If you're national, but you're not a citizen?
Well, by international law, you could change your citizenship, but the country of your birth is your native country.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're a naturalized citizen, you know, that citizenship could be revoked. It's not permanent.
True.
So, I did a case whereby a certain African was born in England and was charged with some high crimes here in the US. And if you look at the charging documents, even though he carried an African country passport, the charging documents say, blah, 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 is a native of Great Britain. He didn't say native of whatever country his parents come from. So if they have to deport him, they deport him, of course, to England. Whether or not he has traveling documents, because that is his birth country. So that is the generality of the law. I don't know about the Middle Eastern countries if they subscribe to that international.
So my question, though, on the citizenship thing, the dual citizenship thing, is what impact could that have encouraging more countries to do dual citizenship, especially in African countries? Because there are limitations. You can't run for certain office. In some countries, they pick and choose who can have dual citizenship. Like Cameroon, for example, if you're, I guess, a big football star, you can claim dual citizenship. But if you're not one of those, then you're not. And I think it's unfair. But what benefits, what's the country missing by not encouraging dual citizenship?
Because then the diasporans will be denied full participation. in the country where they reside. And that if they have dual citizenship, they could participate fully in their new country. And if they're participating fully in their new country, you see that the remittances to their country of birth will increase. Like, for example, if you look at 40 billion remittances into Africa and 22 billion to Nigeria. And the reason is because of maybe a qualitative level of the immigrants. So if you compare, say, the amount of money going to Nigeria, say in Ethiopia, which is almost similar in numbers, you see in Ethiopia it's like maybe 1 billion. So what that indicates is that the level of participation on the professional level in the new country translate into how much money.
That's true.
So if you're from Zimbabwe and they're having economic issues and they allow their citizens to have dual citizenship, then you see that the citizens overseas could become easy, they could work easier. And they'll remit more money, because the more money you have, the more money. So it helps. So ultimately, I think the country benefits.
So is it ignorance? Well, we all know the answer. I think it's not. I think they do know the benefits. I think it's not the issue of accountability, because diasporans maybe will be challenging.
I agree with you. It's a control thing.
It's a control thing. Now let's talk about how we fare as people of African descent. I'm curious to know from someone like you that likes literature, history, the law, passionate about everything socio-political. I want you to give me your take on collective and individual success among Africans and people of African descent, and how that impacts how we lead leadership in Africa.
I think what we lack, we are more, what we lack is the collectivity of, say, destiny. We're a little bit too individualistic. That's what I believe. Okay. And I'm talking about even at the personal level, we're unable to form like partnerships. Or here we have like Wells Fargo or Bank of America. The founders are long dead, but the legacy is on. Back home, we are unable to create a wealth in a sustainable manner, because there's no collectivity. If you find a church in Africa, it could be so big, but somehow it's going to be transmitted to the son. The son may not have
the skills
of a pastor. So you see that after one generation, that will falter and goes. But if you come over here, that is where the West have done better. They believe in competency and responsibility. They believe somehow in the general good. So that is where it's like, if we could bridge that gap, whereby we start to think in terms of the general good. So people in position of authority think of what is best, and the followership or the cities key into that. Then we will surmount. I don't want to bore you with history, but there's something I read a long time ago when the OAU was being formed. And I think they went to Liberia, because Liberia being an independent country. And there was a chief who became aware that we were trying to formulate a union. And he said, this is a great idea. That, do you know that as we're here and a snake start coming in, what are we going to do? Of course, we're going to kill it. But what if it's 1 million snakes coming? What are you going to do? Every person will run. So, that collectivity, if we could come together and strive to start thinking more inclusively, togetherness, I think Africa will have no limits.
Absolutely. And just on a note that people of African descent are everywhere, I want you to give me a final note on how we can bridge and make not just the continent better, but even for ourselves out here, like the Jews.
Well, but the Jews, they've been prepared to be together. we are more divergent than the Jewish people. Of course, we have a part in colonialism. Like you see, Cameroonian and Nigerian, they are brothers basically.
Yeah, but we let ourselves be divided.
But you have a division
Right.
imposed by colonialism. So now they say, well, I'm a Cameroonian, or I'm a Nigerian. But if you go and look at the broad lines, I mean, it's the same.
Exactly.
So it's stuff like that. So it's you know, I don't know if I have an answer for that.
You know what the answer is? The fact that you and I are sitting here, and most of us in the diaspora, we all see each other as Africans. When I'm in need, you're my brother. When I'm in need, a Togolese is my brother. In the diaspora, I think that's where that union, maybe the diaspora will be the solution, hopefully.
I'm hoping so. That would be great.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Great conversation. We have to follow this conversation next time on Africa Space with Med Levi Uku and Pamela Anchang. Thanks for watching.